Hello, friends. How's everyone doing tonight? Woo! Are you ready for another edition of SpectreVision Radio here? Thank you so much for coming out. My name is Alex McDonald. I'm a programmer here at the Philosophical Research Society. I also edit some of our trailers. I did that Nutcracker Fantasy one and the Alan Watts, Anyway, welcome. Who is here at PRS for the first time tonight? Okay, a whole bunch of people. Well, welcome. Let me give you a little rundown because it's a fascinating space for a fascinating evening. So this space was founded, we are in our 90th year as a Philosophical Research Society, everybody. Society was founded in 1934 by a man named Manly Palmer Hall. Hall was a comparative religion scholar, author, lecturer, philosopher, world traveler, and a mystic in his own right. He started the society as like a traveling salon sort of space for people to share their ideas and learn about metaphysics and the esoteric, and then founded this place, built the library here first in 1936. And it was sort of founded at the nexus of spirituality, philosophy, science, and the arts. We are now 501c3 Arts and Events nonprofit. We keep that original legacy alive with evenings like tonight and classes, lecture, and workshops on philosophy, spirituality, the occult, metaphysics, and so on. But we also do a very wide, expansive range of arts programming, everything from Buto dance workshops and electronic feedback sound baths, and we have a monthly death cafe, an astrology salon, game nights. We do puppetry, theater, comedy, experimental films on 16 millimeter, all sorts of stuff. I'm primarily the film programmer here, and wide range of stuff. So I hope that you will join us for upcoming events. Join our email list, follow us on Instagram, blah, blah, blah. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see you again soon. I do want to talk about a few events upcoming. Tomorrow night, we are screening Nutcracker Fantasy on 16 millimeter. This movie is batshit and beautiful and incredible, and it sort of plays like if someone translated the original E.T.A. Hoffman novel from German to Japanese to English, back to Japanese, back to English. It's got Christopher Lee and Roddy McDowell and Joanne Worley and Dick Van Patten and all these 70s Hollywood Squares style voice talents, and it is gorgeously animated Japanese stop-motion animators. It is sold out, so I'm being a bit of a tease, but we always have a standby line, and we typically get everybody in standby in, so it is worth checking out. On Sunday, we have a screening of Eva Arrigues's La Santa Muerte, incredible documentary that focuses on the Mexican cult around Saint Death. Super fascinating. And also that afternoon, we have our astrology and writing workshop with Vivi Henriette and our own Liz Vasquez, writing our way through messy times. I think we could all use a little of that right now. Then later on Sunday evening, we have a presentation by LA historians Dominic Priore and Dan Konoski celebrating Zappadan with Freakout Hotspots. It's about basically the history of Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention through various landmarks in LA, many of them long gone. Their previous lectures have been totally fascinating, and we're very pleased to welcome them back. Almost done here. On the 11th, we have a tarot workshop called Don't Call the Devil Your Lover. It's with the incredible Christopher Marmolejo. And then the last thing I'll mention is we have our annual Krampus nights on the 13th and 14th. These things are a blast. They're a party. They always sell out. If you want your photo taken with unbelievable full-body Krampus costumed characters, come for that. There's music. There's Glühwein, spiked Glühwein for sale. There's crafts. There's a presentation on Krampus through history, popular culture, and lore. It is a blast. I'm so pleased to welcome SpectreVision Radio back with your host, Jim Perry. for Uncanny, the reality of ESP, Precognition, and Telepathy with the wonderful Mitch Horowitz. Can we have a round of applause? So SpectreVision has a monthly podcast residency with us, typically on the first Friday of every month. And if you're not familiar with SpectreVision Radio, it's kind of an umbrella and houses 12 fantastic podcasts, all focusing on the uncanny and the unexplained. I was actually featured on one of the last ones, telling some ghost stories, some of which may or may not have happened here at PRS. You'll have to listen. You can check that out on their Signal Intrusion and Euphemet podcasts. Tonight is being recorded for their new program, Extraordinary Evidence, ESP is Real. You can check out the first 6 episodes as you get ready to relive and share this evening. I do want to mention, before getting into introducing our esteemed guests for the evening, that we are having our end-of-year giving campaign right now to help keep the lights on and the roof on here. And for a $250 donation, you can have a personal one-on-one Zoom conversation with this guy named Mitch Horowitz. There are 3 left, so I hope you will join and help us keep events like this going. One thing I do want to mention, too, is on the subject of ESP, there is a really fascinating ESP connection to PRS with one of the folks that Mitch will be discussing tonight, Dr. Stanley Krippner. So Manley wrote a book in the early 1920s called An Essay on the Fundamental Principles of Operative Occultism. Say that 10 times fast. And it was basically inspired by 3 pieces of art by kind of mystical artist M.K. Seralian, one of which was this one here, the 7 spinal chakras. And in 1971, Krippner did an experiment with the Grateful Dead, where they held concerts in February, and in each one, everybody dropped acid, and they projected this image, of one of the images they projected on the wall, and everybody was supposed to focus on it and send it to a sleeper who was blocks away, sleeping in their apartment, or probably in a more controlled atmosphere, actually. And they were supposed to try to have vision as to what this image was. And they were pretty right on. So yeah, just a little bit of side PRS ESP history. But I've blabbered enough. I want to introduce a friend of ours, much in Manley's legacy. Manley was all about not gatekeeping esoteric knowledge, but bringing it to people in a way that they could understand and digest. I feel no one carries that torch forward more than Mitch Horowitz, one of today's most acclaimed voices of esoterica, mysticism, and the unexplained. He hosts Discovery and HBO's Alien Encounters, Fact or Fiction, SpectreVision's new podcast, recording here tonight, Extraordinary Evidence, ESP is Real, and plays himself in Shudder's VHS Beyond. A Penn Award-winning historian with bylines in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, Mitch has appeared on CBS Sunday Morning, Dateline NBC, NPR's All Things Considered, and throughout national media. A former vice president at Penguin Random House, Mitch is the author of books including Occult America, The Miracle Club, Daydream Believer, Modern Occultism, and the forthcoming Practical Magic. His work is censored in China, but not here. Let's welcome Mitch Horowitz.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all so much. It's wonderful to be here. I feel myself an honorary citizen of the state of California, and that's largely due to the presence of PRS, a place that always uplifts me whenever I'm here to speak or to search or to look in the library or the bookstore. I want to, in addition to thanking all my friends at PRS, thank everyone at SpectreVision and SpectreVision Radio, including folks here tonight, the great Jim Perry, with whom I'm collaborating, Daniel Noah, who is seated up here, our visionary-in-chief, Antonio Diantino. They have been such a source of encouragement to me in not only diving headfirst into the world of podcasts, but encouraging me in inquiries like the one that we're going to explore tonight. And this inquiry tonight is unusual for me because it has an audio-visual component. I tend to be extremely lo-fi. I'm the guy who I ride a fixed gear bicycle. This is literally true. But my partner, Jacqueline Castel, a feature film director and brilliant curator and visual artist, has come to my assistance once again in preparing this audio-visual presentation in which we are going to explore in 6 parts the beginnings and the current reality of parapsychology. Parapsychology, simply put, is the science of studying the supernatural. And when we use science in the Western world, it tends to have this weighty tone of religiosity. And I feel that that's really very unnecessary. Science is methodological replication. That's all it is. And in terms of my own quest to probe the reality of the supernatural, I certainly feel that I could be called a rationalist. I could be called a believer in the scientific method. I don't restrict reality to the scientific method. Something occurs because it occurs. If it's replicable, it can be subjected to the scientific method, but I don't view that as some sort of a gatekeeping mechanism that tells us what we experience or dictates what testimony does or does not contain veracity. But my continual challenge to our culture, which kind of puffs itself up with this point of view, especially within academia and mainstream media, that it abides science and rationality, my challenge to them is, then you have to follow that road with me wherever it goes, and it goes to some pretty strange places. We're going to start early on with the experience of modern spiritualism here in the United States. In the winter of 1848, a pair of adolescent girls, Margaret and Kate Fox, who were living in central New York State outside the city of Rochester. Anyone here from Rochester tonight? Okay, well, it's their damn fault for not being here. But they lived in a town called Hydesville, you can't make this up, outside of Rochester. And they told their shocked Methodist parents that the bangs and raps that were being heard throughout the family cabin were spirit raps, and that the young girls had come up with a method of communication with the dead. The cabin was descended upon by clergy, scientists, reporters, judges, including the legendary newspaper editor and reformist Horace Greeley, and they came away saying, guess what? Kate and Margaret are telling the truth. And thus began the modern tradition of spiritualism in our nation. Spiritualism was brought to the forefront of the American mind, and people were lured into participation in seances, table tilting, midnight raps by this man, Andrew Jackson Davis, also somebody who lived nearby the central New York region in the industrial town of Poughkeepsie, and he was jokingly referred to in the press as the Poughkeepsie Seer. What people misunderstood is that part of the reason why the spiritualist experience spread so quickly and fully was not only that it provided people with what they described themselves in diaries, articles, letters, interviews, as some of the most moving experiences of their lives, but the progenitors of spiritualism were very much everyday people. Kate and Margaret Fox were a pair of adolescent girls from central New York State. Andrew Jackson Davis, he's a little bit older here in this bearded photograph, but when he began his career, more or less concurrent with the Fox sisters, he was a 17-year-old cobbler's apprentice in the town of Poughkeepsie. Today, in a kind of a post-industrial town, Poughkeepsie has seen its share of struggles. It's a town that I love. And there was an ordinariness to these people. And the ordinariness ignited in many Americans the best instinct, which was that you don't necessarily need the man in the robes or the gatekeeper or liturgy or dogma at your side in order to pierce the veil to the unknown. Maybe it's something that you could do at your own parlor table. And Andrew, in his books and lectures, he would go into a mediumistic trance or a mesmeric trance. He provided instructions for Americans to join hands around seance tables and to solicit communication with the spirit world. People were absolutely enthralled by it, including some very widely known people, such as those who occupied the White House itself. There were most likely two different sets of seances in the Lincoln White House, one in 1862, one in 1863. Now, the one in 1863 is dead to rights true because Abe Lincoln invited a reporter from the Boston Gazette to sit in on the seance. And his biographer, Carl Sandburg, wondered in his volumes on the life of Abe Lincoln, why would the president invite a reporter to sit in on a seance? Wouldn't this be embarrassing? Wouldn't this make you seem weird? And the country was different then, even though it was a time of warfare and division and bloodshed and something none of us would ever want to go back to. There was an unembarrassed quality about spiritualism. And my contention is that Lincoln actually felt that having a reporter witness him at the seance table served a shrewd political purpose because he wanted to communicate to the public at large, including to people who lived in the Confederacy, that the commander-in-chief was not overly encumbered by wartime command, that he could kind of kick back and enjoy this strange novelty or experiment that all kinds of Americans were participating in. And sure enough, not only did an article about the seance appear in the Boston Gazette, but it appeared in several, it was reprinted in several newspapers of the Confederacy, including the Macon, Georgia Telegraph. So people who occupied the Confederate states were also reading about this. And I think Lincoln knew exactly what he was doing. Now, one of these images, the one of the piano bumping up and down, Jim Perry liked this. I put fanciful image in parentheses next to it. It's speculative history. It's a fanciful image. Here he's seated in the other photograph with a medium named Nettie Colburn Maynard, who wrote a book in 1891 called Was Abraham Lincoln a Spiritualist? She claimed that Lincoln, in fact, held seances with her in the White House in 1862, and the 1863 seances were reported by the Boston Gazette. This is dead to rights reality. This is real occult history. Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd, was a very committed spiritualist, and after his death, she visited the so-called spirit photographer, William Mumler, in Boston. And as you can see, Mumler purported to take a photograph of Mrs. Lincoln with Abe. You can see the image of Abe behind her, resting his hands on her shoulder. Now dig this. Now, of course, we all know that Mumler was a fraud, right? Well, he was arrested and he was indicted on charges of fraud back at the time that this image was taken, which was in 1872, but he wasn't convicted because the efforts that he used to doctor photographs were so sophisticated that the authorities were unable to figure out the scientific apparatus behind it. Another spiritualist who was a Scottish-American figure, widely known, was Daniel Douglas Hume. It's spelled home, but it's pronounced Hume. Now, Hume was a physical medium, and I want to point something out. And it's one of these things that must be spoken of accurately if the historical record is going to be sound. Hume performed all kinds of sensationalistic feats. You see him here levitating, walking outside his building. He would levitate pianos. He would play musical instruments from across the room. I'm just going to say this because it's the record, and it's nothing but the record. He was active for 25 years. He was widely investigated, no fraud was ever proven. Now, mediums who stick around for a long time, like 25 years, if they are practicing fraud, usually time finds them out. Time finds them out. There's always that one night where you tip your hand, you mess up, it's Mercury retrograde, something doesn't go right. He was never found out as a fraud. He was studied by a British physicist named William Crookes. And Crookes published his own scientific journal, and starting in 1870, he investigated Hume with a greater degree of rigor than had ever been witnessed before on the spiritualist scene. And he was unable to find any evidence of fraud. He published his findings in his journal. They were referred to and rejected by the British Royal Society, which was the British Chamber of Arts and Sciences, but they were rejected strictly on a cultural basis. There was no counter evidence provided that said we're rejecting your evidence because it was poorly juried, or because the controls were poor, or because there was some box that was left unchecked. It's just a note about history that I think needs to be made. But still in all, these investigations were largely going on within the lace curtain, gaslit atmosphere of the Victorian seance parlor. The question that inquiring scientific minds, clinicians, and researchers had was, is there a way that we can pool our efforts together, compare our data, and form a kind of thought school and a sort of ad hoc invisible college of researchers who are willing not only to go into the seance parlor, but to bring the seance parlor into the laboratory. And so the great American philosopher William James collaborated with several of his British colleagues, scientists including F.W.H. Myers, who is widely credited with being the first psychologist to speak of the subconscious mind or the unconscious mind. Arthur Balfour, who was Britain's prime minister, the moral philosopher and economist Oliver Lodge. It's almost a who's who of scientists, philosophers, clinicians, figures in American and European letters who formed the Society for Psychical Research. And the Society for Psychical Research made the first concerted efforts, again, to not only meet mediums on their own terms, but bring them into the lab. You might be surprised to know there was a very rigorous young physician who joined both the American and British branches of the Society for Psychical Research, and that was none other than the great materialist himself, Sigmund Freud. Only Sigmund Freud was not such a materialist. We're often taught to believe in our Psych 101 courses that Freud and Jung were these opposing polarities, and Freud kicked out the more occult and esoteric leaning Jung from his fold. But in fact, if you read this quote up here, which was written in Freud's own hand in 1921, he rued the fact that he didn't spend more time researching dream telepathy, clairvoyance, ESP, thought transference, and other things that he witnessed in the analyst's office during sessions of psychoanalysis. Freud, he certainly did his part to preserve his very stolid Herr Doktor reputation, but he was also surrounded by people who felt that if he were more ingenuous and more disclosing about his interests in ESP and the psychical, it could smear his reputation. And they were concerned with ensuring that psychoanalysis had a place at the table of mainstream medicine. So many of Freud's statements, including statements that he made in the early 1920s in papers called Psychoanalysis and Telepathy, another paper called Dream Telepathy, they were postponed until after his death in 1939. You'll find them in the collected Freud. but they were not published until 1940 or 1941 after the doctor's death. So again, you start to see this undercurrent of a suppressed occult history around the psychical. You, of course, had popular media figures like Harry Houdini, who dedicated a good part of his latter career to exposing fake mediums and psychics as he saw it. And Houdini was a peculiar figure because, first of all, listen, there's no question that the man was one of the greatest magicians, stage magicians of modern life, a brilliant escape artist, and he did expose frauds, and there were lots of frauds. But the grave tragedy of Houdini's efforts is that he would always lead with the headline of, "I'm exposing frauds," and he would demonstrate what might be called a kind of publication bias. Those cases that he couldn't crack were never talked about, never reported. These were things he never gave interviews about. These were things that never appeared in his books. And Houdini's own death is a case in point. He and his wife, Bess, were sufficiently invested in the actual reality of after-death communication so that they had a private, secret family code that they worked out. And Harry asked Bess to do her very best to communicate with him after death in the event that she outlasted him. A medium named Arthur Ford, using this secret code, which he had no knowledge of, which Harry and Bess had spoken of no one with, and which only existed in written form in a bank vault, Bess held seances with Arthur Ford, and she maintained that Ford used this unknown code to reach Harry's mother and to reach Harry himself. She issued a confirmatory statement to the press. As with the case of Freud, she was descended upon by people who felt that this would sully her husband's legacy, and they implored her to rescind her validation of Ford's efforts. They also spread sundry stories in the press that she and Ford were having an affair, which may have been true. It doesn't change matters of life and death, last I checked. And so Bess wound up rescinding the validation of Ford's success. So it's kind of a funny thing. When people claim experience of something that surpasses all ordinary observation, let's look at it. Let's examine it. But if you, and this happens all the time, it happens in media today, if you find, let's say, some percentage of cases, let's say it's 5%, that elude all mundane explanation, isn't that where to start digging? Rather than to tuck that away in the file drawer somewhere and say, it's all garbage. You know, I have a friend, a geologist named Robert Schock. He has an expression that I've always liked. Something only has to be a little bit true in order to change everything. The people who sought this, to investigate these cases that were a little bit true, were a couple from Pennsylvania, J.B. and Louisa Rhine. And these are my intellectual heroes. J.B. and Louisa got married as adolescents. They were both educated, received doctorates in botany at the University of Chicago. This was in the early 1920s. Very rare for a woman to receive a PhD in the hard sciences at an Ivy school at that time. They studied botany because botany was the leading field employing statistics, clinically gathered statistics in the sciences. So they had sort of a covert purpose for studying botany. And their wish, their dream, was to bring mediumship and cases of reported clairvoyance into a clinical lab setting, a linoleum-tiled, fluorescent-lit lab setting composed of total control, and to subject people to very, very simple tests. And that is what they started to do in the late 1920s, early 1930s at the Duke University Parapsychology Lab. You can see JB here testing 2 subjects on what are called Zener cards. Look very carefully at these Zener cards. These are going to become very meaningful in your lives tonight because we're going to be using these as part of our ESP bingo. And, you know, JB noticed that in lab settings, to help spike instances of ESP, and this was something he made very careful note of, there had to be incentives. So there's going to be prizes later for ESP bingo. We have these X-ray goggles. These are scientifically validated instruments of parapsychology. You can win a signed copy of Modern Occultism. And if you keep winning, we're just going to keep adding prizes. And they're going to get better and better. You're going to go on a picnic with Jim Perry tomorrow. All weather. So make careful note of those. JB and a colleague of his, a psychologist named Carl Zener, invented this 5-suit deck of cards. Super, super simple with these familiar symbols. Squiggly line, cross, circle, 5-pointed star, etc. And the idea, you know, very, very simply, was that if you take 5 of these cards and you put them into a deck, the deck was traditionally 25 cards, you got a 1 in 5 chance or a 20% chance of getting correct guess rates. It's the law of stats. It's the law of probability. Over many, many hits, you're more or less going to come out at 20% hit rate. JB, again and again, over thousands, then tens of thousands, then millions, up to 3 million trials, found that there were subjects who were consistently getting hit rates that violated the law of probability. 25%, 26%, 27%, and in some cases, a great deal more. You may remember, those of you of a certain age, seeing Zener cards and JB's tests lovingly lampooned at the beginning of the great Ghostbusters. And we're going to play you a little clip of that.
Square.
Good guess, but wrong. Clear your head. All right? Tell me what you think it is.
Is it a star?
It is a star.
Very good. That's great.
Okay? All right. Think hard. What is it?
Circle.
Close, but definitely wrong. Okay? All right. Ready?
Yeah.
All right. What is it?
Figure 8.
Incredible. That's 5 for 5. You can't see these, can you?
No.
You're not cheating me, are you?
No, I swear they're just coming to me.
Okay. Nervous?
Yes. I don't like this.
You only have 75 more to go. Okay? What's this one?
It's a couple wavy lines.
Sorry, this isn't your lucky day.
I know. Wait, yeah. I'm getting a little tired of this.
You volunteered, didn't you? We're paying you, aren't we?
Yeah, but I didn't know you were going to be giving me electric shocks. What are you trying to prove here anyway?
I'm studying the effect of negative reinforcement on ESP ability.
The effect? I'll tell you what the effect is. It's pissing me off.
Well, then maybe my theory is correct.
You can keep the $5. I've had it.
I will, mister. You may as well get used to that. It's the kind of resentment that your ability is going to provoke in some people.
So, obviously, Dr. Venkman was right. There would be a great deal of resentment towards the exceptional. And JB's star subject was an exceptional divinity student at Duke named Hubert Pierce, later became a Methodist minister in the state of Arkansas. Not only were Hubert's scores statistically just off the books, but JB had one session with Hubert where he scored an incredible, an impossible 25 out of 25 hits. And I will tell you the following. I have researched this episode upside down, inside out, and every which way. And there is not a skeptic out there, and I have read their work, and I have pursued them, who has been able to demonstrate fraud on Hubert's part beyond the most absurd suppositions, including a now deceased English skeptic named C.E.M. Hansel, who speculated that when Hubert was being given long-distance ESP tests, he might have crawled up through an air shaft and looked in a non-existent trap door at the top of the lab to peek at the cards. Sometimes I wonder if rationalists actually read their own writing. And you will frequently hear the name of the great English rationalist, Enlightenment philosopher from the late 1700s, David Hume, invoked. I've read a lot of David Hume, and rationalists will tell you, falsely, that David Hume provided a philosophy that upended claims of the miraculous. He did no such thing. Hume provided a very simple formula for judging the miraculous, and the formula was this. If claims against the miraculous start to become more fantastical than the extraordinary claims themselves, than the extraordinary reportage themselves, then empiricism starts to weigh on the side of the extraordinary. If a skeptic has to go to the point of speculating about Hubert walking across campus, crawling through an air shaft, and looking through a non-existent trapdoor, then the weight of empiricism begins to support him. Many of these people are no longer with us, but the record must be stated plainly. It's not enough to say that no fraud was ever proven. It must be said that the efforts to implicate people of fraud in the Rhine Lab and in other settings that are widely known in the annals of parapsychology border on the almost comical and vaudevillian. This is how far rationalists have to go not to concede empiricism, which is the basis of rationalism. The 1960s come, and in one sense, the 1960s provided wonderful openings for parapsychology because a lot like our own time, everywhere you looked, there was realignment. People were asking questions politically, culturally, religiously. And it was not always easy for some of the old guard to accommodate itself to the 1960s. A person who I regard as, in some respects, the Einstein of parapsychology is a young man who came of age in the 60s, Charles Honorton. He is seen here, he's 19 years old. This was in 1965 outside the Rhine Labs in Durham, North Carolina. Honorton was a child prodigy who at age 13 had devoured all the books on ESP research at his local library in St. Paul, Minnesota. So a high school teacher of his suggested that Honorton try writing to the master himself, J.B. Rhine. And he did so, and he and Rhine would exchange letters every week for several years. And J.B. invited Honorton to come to the lab, the parapsychology lab, one summer on an all-expense-paid internship. And as soon as Honorton, whose friends called him Chuck, as soon as Chuck showed up at the lab, immediately he and Rhine could not get along. Chuck was born with dwarfism. He was born prematurely, and some of his he suffered lifelong health problems because of a lack of development in infancy. And I love J.B. Ryan. I truly, truly love the man. But I think that J.B., who was a very handsome, square-jawed, former Marine sharpshooter, beautifully articulate figure, spoke with a mid-Atlantic accent. I've described him physically as almost a cross between Cary Grant, Burt Lancaster. He really was a very powerful media figure. And I think that he felt that because parapsychology was so violative of ordinary observation, that whomever his protege was needed to likewise be a very powerful media figure. So he could never really connect with Chuck. And I think that was a great, great failing, because Chuck went on to do some of the most important experiments and the most bulletproof experiments in ESP studies, called the Gansfeld experiments. JB had a notion, I call his approach sometimes the X-Men approach. JB had a notion that certain gifted individuals possessed ESP. And his contention was that before we start to speculate about whether ESP exists in the population in general, we need to determine whether it exists among anybody. So he tended to gravitate towards what he saw as very gifted subjects, like a Hubert Pierce. Chuck felt that it's very possible that ESP exists among the general population, and he wondered if there were certain conditions that would heighten ESP occurrence. And he speculated, and his speculation turned out to be very valid and right, that it might be prime time for ESP if you could kind of turn down the noise, turn down the excessive stimuli that we all live among. Take a subject, place him or her in conditions of comfortable sensory deprivation, in a noise-proof chamber, reclined maybe in a reclining chair, completely dark or a very soft light, eye shades, headphones, maybe the headphones emit white noise. And outside this chamber sits a sender, and the sender makes an effort to project images to the subject inside the chamber, who's known as the receiver. So the sender has a set of 4 images that he or she is attempting to mentally transmit. And 3 are decoys, and 1 is the real deal, the one that they're looking for. Well, the stats that Chuck got surpassed even Ryan's own. So if you have 4 images, you got a 25% chance of getting a guess hit rate, a guess that's correct. He starts getting stats that are not only above chance, but are 36%, 37%, 38%. And it's not among people who are part of the X-Men. It's not among people who seem specially gifted, but everyday people, including people who have no apparent or previously spoken of interest in ESP. And Chuck runs thousands and thousands and thousands of experiments, and the skeptics are howling. They are howling in protest because this material, this database, is even more impressive than what JB found, and it's more widespread among the population. And as many of you are aware, the back and forth between parapsychologists and skeptics can be endless. And Chuck did something that no other parapsychologist has done before or since. And jumping ahead of things a bit, but in 1986, he collaborated with a career skeptic, a man who's still living, named Ray Hyman, who was a professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Oregon. And he and Ray Hyman went over thousands of different experiments, culled out those experiments that they felt were legit, were valid, were bulletproof. They bunched them into a meta-analysis, and they issued a joint statement. And in that joint statement, both Honorton and Hyman wrote that we have reviewed all the data, there's no pollution, there's no corruption, there's nothing wrong with the math, and there's nothing wrong with the laboratory conditions. And Hyman said, While I don't believe in the ESP thesis, I agree that there is a genuine statistical anomaly at work here, and it warrants greater research. That's all. What an extraordinary intellectual breakthrough. It upends everything that many of us in this room were raised to believe, which is that life is just a flesh and blood experience, and while there may be an afterlife, or there may be angels, or there may be people somewhere playing harps on clouds, the fact is the mind is an epiphenomenon of the brain, and when the brain is gone, the mind is gone. Just like bubbles in a carbonated glass of water are gone when the water's gone, and that life is a physicalist chemical process. A career skeptic, and you can read Ray's work yourself, Ray has dedicated his entire career to upending parapsychological claims, but for this one episode, and it never repeated because Chuck tragically died of heart failure in 1992 at age 46. And this effort never repeated. As I have often said, it is the equivalent of losing Einstein at the dawn of his relativity theories. This is the pathos of life. You lose an extraordinary visionary and you get set back, and it set the field back. There were other more adventurous efforts in the 1960s. Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, aka Ram Dass, felt that in their LSD experiments at Harvard, they experienced testimony among their circle and the students and the other faculty they work with of ESP. And in fact, JB, a very conservative guy, took magic mushrooms with Ram Dass and Timothy Leary. It didn't go all that well because I think there were probably a lot of cultural differences among them. But as Alex was mentioning earlier, Stanley Krippner, still living, great parapsychologist, and Chuck collaborated. They worked with the Grateful Dead. They not only had Grateful Dead audiences projecting images of the chakras to receivers at other locations and had successful results, but they worked with the folk singer many of you may know, Richie Havens. He opened Woodstock, and one night they asked the Dead's audience to project images of birds, and Richie Havens was one of the receivers, and he absolutely reported having images of birds. So they did experiments that the counterculture was able to get behind. It was difficult for JB and his cohort because their ideal was, bring the far out into the lab, and of course Leary and company wanted to bring the far out from the lab, back into the world. But I would have to say there were advances. But those advances were soon going to meet with problems because the skeptics were not taking any of this lying down, and the field had intrinsic difficulties. I must point out, and it would be unfair of me not to point out, that some of the stats that I'm reporting to you, they might not seem all that impressive to a person from everyday life. They might not seem all that impressive to a newspaper reporter, for example. They certainly won't seem impressive to anybody reading Wikipedia, which is a junked up, jargon-laden, very, very poorly crowdsourced resource for matters of parapsychology. The pages on Wiki that deal with parapsychology are overwhelmingly dominated by activist skeptics, so it's very hard for people to learn things, and it's not always easy for people to appreciate statistical significance of just a few percentage points. But when those few percentage points are demonstrating an aspect of reality that we've been taught to reject, they're remarkable. Now, one of the biggest stars in parapsychology may or may not have helped move the ball down the field, and that is the still living Uri Geller, who appeared one night on The Tonight Show in 1973. Uri was famous for bending spoons, and you will hear in the mainstream culture that this was the Waterloo for parapsychology because Uri failed to bend a spoon on The Tonight Show in front of Johnny Carson, and I'll have you know, Ricardo Montalban, and who was very supportive, as you'll see. And I want to show a brief clip of this episode.
I hope the camera can focus on this. Oh, it's.
Yeah. It does look like there's a slight
No,
bend in
it'll
it.
keep bending. It bends more. Usually, it bends more after it happens. And this is what if this is one of the thickest point of the spoon. Well, you can definitely see and feel it. And you felt it.
Yes,
too,
indeed.
so-
Yes, I did.
Okay, now of course this is not a big bend, Johnny. Before the show, one of your video man brought me a key, and I did it for him. Completely bent to, I'd say,
He showed it to me,
40
yeah.
degrees. But there, I'll put it here, and it'll keep going. Look,
Do we have
there
to-
I had no.
Can we cut away again and still come back here?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, we'll be right back after another word from one of our sponsors. Well, Uri, I don't want you to feel bad about this tonight. The monologue doesn't work every night either. And maybe
Thank
it's...
you. I don't feel bad about it. It
Maybe it-
happens to me not once, but it happens quite a lot when I cannot perform and do things.
Would you like to try it again some evening if you want to?
Yeah, I
mean, you
guess,
could. I'll be happy to extend an invitation to you.
You know, Johnny, just to finish that, this was quite an important appearance for me here tonight. And really, in other places, I felt real good. And I knew I could perform things. Because maybe this was and is an important appearance for me tonight, I might be blocking myself.
Now, I have not always been, I think, as constructive or as engaged with Uri Geller as I should have been. And I want to start to reverse that because Uri has a checkered reputation. And he actually just wrote to me the other day because of something I posted. And I think that he has been mistreated because I, like everyone else, believed that he went on The Tonight Show and humiliated himself. Why did I believe that? Because everyone knows it's true. And what everyone knows is true must be true. But when you sit down and you watch this 22-minute clip, which is freely available on YouTube, you do see that Johnny himself, who was a skeptic, Johnny started out as a kid as a stage magician. He walked in the footsteps of Houdini, and he considered magic something for which you train. It's showmanship, it's entertainment. It's not something that somebody has some supernatural faculty for, but Johnny, too, acknowledged that the spoon has a slight bend on it. This is on national television, and Johnny cooperated with a group of skeptics, one of whom will be coming up, and they did everything they could to snooker Uri. He did not fail. He did not fail. Uri was part of Project Stargate, which was a 20-year running CIA program that involved psychic spying. The Soviet Union had been doing it, and so if the Soviets were doing it, American cold warriors felt, we have to do it. The men who spearheaded this program were two Stanford physicists, who you see pictured here, Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff. Fun fact, Russell Targ's father was in publishing, as I used to be. He was Richard Targ, and he was the editor of Mario Puzo's novel, The Godfather. It's kind of interesting. So the two of them collaborated on this program. It was 20-year running. It was a program in remote viewing, and they had remarkable successes where they would ask so-called remote viewers to focus in on a target. So this is just some randomly chosen material that I've selected from the archives of the Stargate program, which were recently assembled into a multi-volume series of books by parapsychologist Ed May and a colleague. And you'll see that these were targets. There was a radio tower, and at the bottom is a drawing of the radio tower. There's some kind of island archipelago there on the right-hand side of the screen, and over on the left, at least from where I am, is a drawing of it that had a lot of remarkable successes. And Jimmy Carter himself was a supporter of the program. Carter, after he was out of office, was giving a talk in 1995 at Emory University in Atlanta. And he told the students that there was, during his administration, a Soviet spy plane, a Soviet spy jet, crashed in the jungles of Zaire in Central Africa. And this was a big deal for both the Soviet Union and the United States because the plane was filled with advanced espionage technology. So the Soviets wanted their recon team to get to it first and take away all the goodies. And the CIA wanted its recon team to reach it first and get all the goodies and have an intelligence coup against the other side. And Carter told the students, well, there was so much shrubbery and tree coverage within the jungle that our spy satellites were unable to get a bead on the coordinates. So we asked some of the remote viewers, the so-called psychic spies, to try to read us the coordinates, and two of them at SDI, at the Sanford Project Stargate program, they went into trances and they named the coordinates successfully, and a CIA recon team was able to find the plane. And this was a plain, straight-out victory for so-called remote viewing or psychic spying. But in 1995, the same year that Jimmy Carter is publicly speaking of this program, Bill Clinton, in a spate of post-Cold War budget cuts, cut the program. The program was peanuts. It was $20 million over 20 years. And any of you who know about anything about military budgets know that that is next to nothing in terms of a program that was really providing some extraordinary innovations. But this stuff had a bad name, in part because of the workings of this man, James Randi. Let's have a boo for James. Boo. I despise James, and it's not because we're on opposite sides of the issue. William Blake wrote in Marriage of Heaven and Hell, opposition is true friendship. Opposition is true friendship. We need good skeptics. People ask me, why don't you debate more skeptics? And as I often say, I chase after them like they're the Beatles. They back out from debating me. I'm not interested in embarrassing people, but if you want to see the names, you can find them in my books. They're living, they're around, they harass the hell out of people, they impugn people's reputations. I invite them to debate me. They can choose the setting, the moderator, and the microphone. They back out because they don't have the facts on their side. And James did not have the facts on his side. I don't care that I have one position and he has another. I really don't care. What I care about is that you don't flip over the chessboard when the game is going against you. What I care about is inquiry and truth and getting to the facts. Let me give you just a small example of the terribly, terribly misleading things James would do and the calumny he would inflict on people's reputations. When he was still living, and he died only recently, he created an online guide for grade school teachers. Are there any grade school teachers here? No? Yes, all right. He created an online guide for middle and high school teachers to teach the kids about ESP research. There's just no gentle way to put this. James used that guide to outright lie to grade school teachers. He said that if a student, and you can find this online, and if you can't find it online, if it's been taken down, write to me, and I'll send you a PDF of it. I'm really easy to reach. Just put my name into Google, goes to my website, goes to my email. It's the same email, the power company uses. Believe me, I get it. And so James said, if a kid comes to you and says, well, I've read about these J.B. Ryan experiments, and they seem pretty good. What about that? What you're to tell the kid is, oh, JB only reported positive results. He didn't report negative results. I just don't know how to put this. It's a lie. It's a simple lie. JB not only reported every result, left nothing in the file drawer, so to speak, left nothing to so-called publication bias, so to speak, but he led the entire field of the social sciences, not just parapsychology, but the entire field of the social sciences to do the same. Every set must be recorded and reported and published. That was his ethic. He issued a monograph in 1940 called ESP Research After 60 Years. And in that book, he and his collaborators not only reported every set and every result that came out of the Duke Parapsychology Lab, they not only reported similar experiments that were performed at other universities and at other labs and crunched them together, evaluated them, meta-analyzed them. But they went through the additional effort to find unpublished results and to see whether the unpublished results would affect the curve of results. And in fact, what JB found was that when you added the unpublished results into the pool, the data only got better because the publication bias was in favor of publishing negative versus positive results. He pioneered what is called meta-analysis, a term that was not coined until 1976. Even Wikipedia acknowledges this. If you go to the article, unless somebody's already changed it, if you go to the article on meta-analysis on Wiki, you will see that JB led the field 36 years before the term was coined. When I say the field, again, I don't just mean parapsychology, and I don't just mean psychology. I mean the social sciences as a whole, a field that is bedeviled with problems, including today, but one of the great problems that he removed in his efforts at Duke was scuttling away negative results into the file drawer on the very shaky notion that, well, something must have been wrong with our methodology. We'll get it right next time. That's unethical. That's not real science. James, a defender of science, a man who was sung praises to in a documentary called An Honest Liar that some of you may remember. Cute title, false title. James did things like this all the time. He grossly misrepresented people's research. He said he did research that he didn't do. There was a big scandal in his organization in the 1970s because, you can read about this in Modern Occultism, because they set out to do a study disproving astrology. They got confirmatory results. They suppressed their own results. It's absolute hackery. It's absolute anti-intellectualism. And these are the people who claim the title of skeptic in our time. That's the man who inspired the people who were editing the parapsychology pages on Wikipedia that some of you or some of your friends or some of your kids might be reading. Every time my kids go onto Wikipedia, I know I'm in for hell, you know? But, and yet the field continued to grow and continued to grow for one reason, and that is the excellence of the researchers. They just kept coming, almost like a guerrilla army of real rationalists who were unafraid to follow data to its true extent. One of them, who passed away several years ago, is Ian Stevenson, a Canadian-American psychiatrist, who opened a parapsychology lab at UVA, which is still in existence. His dedication was to studying reincarnation. And what Stevenson did, I could spend a whole night on his work alone. He traveled the world compiling thousands of case studies in different countries all across the world of children who were persistently reporting vivid past life memories, including sometimes speaking in foreign languages that they had never learned, or successfully identifying whole family trees of families of which they were never a part, sometimes as young as age 5 or 6 or 7, of people who might have lived some far distance from them. And in an outsized number of cases, the people whose past lives the children seem to be recurring were not infrequently people who had died some kind of a violent death. And Stevenson compiled literally thousands of cases where he might interview, in a formal setting with the parents present, might interview children who had past life memories and identify birthmarks on the kids that correlated to, let's say, entry and exit wounds that might have been experienced by the victim who died a violent death, maybe who was stabbed or who suffered an accident or who was shot. And Stevenson compiled so many cases, and the evidence was so overwhelming, and you can read about this in some of the stuff I've written, that even in Scientific American magazine, the most stolid of general public science publications, there was a career skeptic, an avowed career skeptic, who wrote that Stevenson's work had changed his mind. There is a mainstream journal of nervous disorders, not a parapsychological journal, that dedicated a full issue to Stevenson's work upon his death. If you want to get started on Stevenson's work, he wrote a book in 1965 called 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. If you want to support American publishing, buy a copy of the book, but you can also find a PDF online. It's important to understand the work of these people because against the onslaught of media figures like James Randi and his cohort, contrary to all the career damage that it would do to engineers and MDs and clinicians who were studying parapsychology, extraordinary people just kept coming into the field, Another was a man named Robert John, who headed the engineering department at Princeton University. John told the president of the university that he wanted to start a parapsychology lab, which was not good news to the president of Princeton. So he said to him, "You can start it on one condition. You'll have to privately fund it." So Jean started a lab called the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, or PAIR for short. The lab closed in 2007 at the time of his retirement because, again, for those of you who write grant proposals, you know that writing grant proposals is a full-time career in and of itself. Can you imagine maintaining a laboratory and raising all of your funds privately while still taking on some of your departmental duties as head of a highly rigorous engineering department? It's superhuman, but John did it. And he arrived at findings that are just extraordinary. Jean had a visionary ideal, and that was that maybe, in the same way that Charles Honorton had found that there is an ESP effect among the general public, what if you broaden that to experiment on a global scale with what might be called the global public? So he placed these devices called random number generators at various points throughout the world. And these random number generators, apropos of the title, just spit out entirely chaotic, random series of numbers. These devices are used to set online passwords, for example. There's no pattern whatsoever. But what John and his collaborators at Princeton discovered was that during periods of global trauma or emotion, specifically the events of 9/11 in 2001, there appear interruptions in the randomness. Patterns start to appear in these globally placed random number generators where no patterns ought to appear. Now, 9/11 was a period of a particularly notable dispersion of statistical expectation. In other words, evincing of pattern in the random numbers, an interruption of chaos in favor of symmetry in the random number generators. But this occurred at plenty of other times too, not necessarily at times of tragedy, depending upon your point of view. This occurred during the first election of Barack Obama. This occurred during the first election of Donald Trump. Anytime there was a sense of worldwide emotional intensity, you start to see interruptions in the noise, patterns where no patterns should appear, and this suggests a global consciousness effect. Some of the most recent work in parapsychology, and in my estimation, some of the most exciting and some of the most practical, is attributable to this man, Darrell Bem, who is a clinical research psychologist at Cornell University. In 2011, Bem issued a paper that was published in a mainstream juried psychology journal that was based upon 10 years of his study into precognition. His study rested upon 9 experiments, but the most innovative of these 9 experiments were experiments 8 and 9. And in experiments 8 and 9, Bem found what can be called a retrocausal effect, or an effect of backwards causation. Specifically, now listen to this very carefully, he found that efforts that you make in the so-called future can have an effect, an impact on things going on in the so-called present. It challenges our entire conception of how our life is structured, because we believe that life occurs in a linear pattern. To us five sensory beings, linearity is vitally important. It's necessary to get through life. If this lecture starts at 7 p.m. and I don't show up, or you don't show up at 7 p.m., well, we have problems. So we need linearity, but it's not ultimate reality. Einstein was correct. Space-time bends in certain conditions. Time is composed of infinite events occurring everywhere at once. An idea that squares with quantum mechanics, an idea that squares with fields including psychical research, neuroplasticity, string theory, and Behm's work on retrocausality. In short, Behm instituted these very simple cognitive tests to his subjects. He would ask them to memorize lists of words, very simple cognitive recall test, and then to repeat however many words they could remember. So let's say you're asked to memorize a list of 10 words. After the fact, you might recall 5 or 6. There's sort of a median that's very common. Behm then added a wrinkle to these tests. He asked subjects, in certain cases outside of the control, to continue studying these word lists into the future. And again and again and again, over thousands of trials, he found a few percentage points of increase in cognitive recall ability because of efforts that people continued to make after the fact. It's completely upending of our idea of how life should work. Now dig this. I started writing about Behm's work 10 years after his study, and it was advantageous to me because a decade gives you enough time to reconsider research to see if there were holes in it. Behm's efforts were subjected to retrial in a very, very large meta-analysis that consisted of 90 separate experiments in 33 separate labs in 14 separate nations, and they proved confirmatory. Now, one of the misleading claims you will hear again and again about parapsychology is that this stuff is not replicable. Baloney. Have you any idea of how few experiments in the social sciences and medicine in general, including experiments on pharmaceuticals that I and many of us in this room may be taking right now, have you any idea how few such studies are meta-analyzed with such repeat data under such diffuse circumstances? There were studies done in different languages. Again, 90 different studies, including Behm's originals, in 33 different labs, in 14 different nations, and the results, meta-analyzed, proved confirmatory. Darrell Behm was right. And his reputation has been smeared twice. The New York Times has written about him as the poster child for bad practices in science without ever once demonstrating pollution or problems or corruption in his data. And I have written to the paper in protest of this. I have written for the New York Times on controversial subjects, and it's not easy. And I have been ignored. Crickets. ESP isn't real because ESP isn't real. Everybody knows that. It's a failure. It's a failure of people who think of themselves as rationalists and empiricists to follow the dictates of the facts produced under the very conditions that they call science. Now, I happen to believe that we are experiencing an extraordinary realignment today. We're experiencing a realignment in religion, politics, culture, science, and parapsychology. And part of the reason we're experiencing this realignment is because of the extraordinary spate of UFO sightings, which the Pentagon finally had to acknowledge yesterday. Well, we have no idea what the fuck is going on, so good luck. And it's really remarkable because when I was a kid, if you talked about UFOs or flying saucers, you'd be given a special test or something. You know, you'd have to go home for the day. And, you know, and now I don't think there's any serious person in our culture. I don't think there's any intellectually serious way of denying the weight of evidence for UFOs, UAPs that falls outside the mundane. Whatever percentage that may be, 5% or something larger, there are areas of true mystery. And I think that, look, I'll put it to you this way. If you were to pool together the unexplained cases of UFO phenomena, there are probably three basic explanations that people turn to. One, that it's some sort of secret weapon or something that we don't know anything about. Okay. The other is that it's extraterrestrial. Okay. And the other, the third, which sounds the most far out, but I think is actually the most viable, is the possibility of contact vis-a-vis interdimensionality. Think of it. The models that we have for interdimensionality, bending of space-time, the existence of other intersections of time, due to a near century of quantum physics experiments in which objects are seen to locate in an infinitude of places until a measurement is taken, in which we have to acknowledge that there are infinite outcomes playing out at once, and we are only able to witness that one outcome that is a result of a decision to take a measurement or not to take a measurement, even when using an automatized device like a photometer. We have models of interdimensionality that are still just conceptual, but that are better worked through than our models for interstellar travel. So, for example, Einstein proved that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. And no one's ever been able to violate or disprove that, theoretically or experimentally. Now, there are theories that suggest if you introduce a piece of exotic matter into the equation, you might be able to bend space-time. You've probably heard the expression cosmic wormholes, and it might allow craft or vessel to travel unfathomable distances. I say to you that we have better theories for the so-called many worlds model in quantum physics, or what is sometimes referred to as string theory. We have better conceptual theories worked out for interdimensionality than we do for extraterrestrial travel. And in fact, I would go so far as to say the existence of multiple, in fact, infinite dimensions, multiple, in fact, infinite sections of time with different beings, events, occurrences going on infinitely all at once, everywhere around us. This is a logical necessity based on a century of findings of quantum data. And I think, and plus, mind you, it squares, what I'm describing, squares with special relativity, squares with quantum mechanics, squares with psychical research, squares with fields like neuroplasticity, squares with conceptual models like string theory. And we're told that the simplest answer that covers the greatest number of bases is probably the right one. Well, the most fantastic answer might in fact be the simplest answer, which is interdimensionality. And I think that we're starting to see a convergence between psychical studies and UFO studies. And that was something I was very privileged to speak about on a very recent show, which I want to play you a clip of, which appears on MGM+. I grew up in a religious atmosphere as a child. I had an Orthodox bar mitzvah. There was always an unspoken quality of faith in the household. And I think probably from a very young age, I had an instinct that there was reality in the extra-physical. I had occasional experiences myself involving things like prayer or astrology or tarot readings. And I suppose that my chief interest was in discovering how some of this ancient material had endured across centuries and even millennia. The Neanderthals themselves, quite literally, had their own system of spirituality. They had talismans, they had figurines, they had devotional practices and paintings, and we're talking about the most primeval origins of humanity. So this is obviously something that goes far beyond what we today would call credulity. It's baked into the human experience. There's a convergence today between the question of UFOs and the question of extra-physical experience. When I was growing up, the outlook on UFOs, if one took seriously the UFO thesis, was, well, maybe they're ET craft, and what would it take for some kind of mechanical vehicle to span such distances? But in the past few decades, I would say that the thesis around UFO phenomena, if one takes seriously that it's something that goes outside of ordinary observation, is that these experiences might be from different intersections of time or different dimensions, which when first said sounds very, very far out. But we've known since the age of Einstein that time is conditional, that one has to logically account for the existence of an infinitude of simultaneous events. People will talk about cosmic wormholes, whereby you introduce some exotic matter into a mix of events and you're able to bend space-time. These are all just conceptual models, but it seems to me that the concepts are better developed around interdimensionality than they are around extraterrestriality, which doesn't mean that only one thing is happening. There could be a whole complexity of things that are occurring. The fact is, if we are experiencing evidence from academic psychical research, ESP research, that the psyche is capable of receiving and transmitting information in anomalous ways that may indicate the capacity of the psyche to travel among different intersections of time from which that information presumably emanates. That is possibly parallel to exactly what's going on when people report UFO encounters or abduction experiences. So part of the complexity of human nature is that we are all conditioned to think in terms of magic bullet theories behind events, as though to say there's just one antecedent, and if we can find that, we'll get to the truth. Whereas there's probably a complexity of antecedents. It may be that all of these experiences, whether it's a UFO encounter, whether it's so-called poltergeist activity, whether it's a near-death experience, are reflections, are snapshots in a certain sense of this extra physical field in which the psyche participates. From my perspective, it's a very exciting time because we're experiencing not only the mainstreaming of the UFO thesis, but the conversation around UFOs and the conversation around the psychical or the extra-physical are starting to converge. And that's a hallmark of our time. And so I want to thank you all so much for allowing me to share this exploration with you. I can't tell you how much it means to me. And we're only just getting started because the great Jim Perry is going to come up and join me. We're going to have an exchange, and we're going to open things to you all. And then we're going to play ESP Bingo, and you can get your prizes and so forth. So thank you all so much. Thank you. Come on up. All right, let's do it.
Good to see you, man.
Likewise. We have our chairs.
Hey, everybody. Hi, Doris. While they're setting that up, I'll ask something. Who was here for Ghost Story Slam? One person. Oh my God. Okay, so the plan didn't work. No, there's more. The plan was at the Ghost Story Slam, we gave everyone Zinner cards, and everyone thought it was just a treat that they were delighted to receive. It was actually like quite a feast. Like people were scrambling to get these Zinner cards. It was very entertaining to see. But there was a fight that broke out. It was very strange. But yeah, it didn't.
Was it really a fight?
Well, yeah. You read the police report. So I don't know. I'm just doing this. It's like I've never been on a stage before. But I need to see your eyes. No, so why we actually gave everyone those Zinner cards is because we wanted you to train your abilities for tonight. So tonight, when we play ESP Bingo, we're actually going to ask someone from the audience who feels, sort of particularly powerful with extra sensory tonight to be the sender of a Zinner card symbol. And we'll tell you how all that works. I think we remember, and if not, we have an assist that we can
help us.
So I guess
I got it. Oh, thanks. Okay.
there you go.
I'm gonna take a water. You want a water?
So I spent a lot of time with Mitch over the last few months. One of the things that I figured out very quickly is there's no one that makes you feel more pedestrian than Mitch Horowitz.
It's a great compliment. Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll go on my gravestone.
Yeah, so I'm just going to seem like a very stupid guy over here. But listen, Mitch, that was fascinating, especially going through this series, Extraordinary Evidence, ESP is Real, which is on SpectreVision Radio, available wherever you listen to podcasts, which goes into great detail in each part that is reflected in this presentation. And so I thought that was awesome. Were there stories or elements of stories that you really wish you had time to inject into this presentation that were present in the podcast that you would hope people go and listen?
There is a story that I want to offer because it's very practical. I'm not sure if we specifically included this in the podcast, but I have written about it. About 18 months ago, I was contacted by a professional Thai kickboxer named Spencer Hanley. And he explained to me that he had a fight outside of Austin, Texas in 9 days. And he was feeling very good about his training, but he wanted some help in staying on his physical game. And so I gave him an exercise, which Darcy was talking about earlier and gives to her students, called the 30-Day Mental Challenge. And it's a very simple positive mind exercise. You can find it for free online. And he said to me, look, I am going to do this, but I need something short-term. And I suggested to him, let's get outside the box of thinking in terms of short-term, because if you do this exercise leading up to the fight and you continue to do it beyond the fight, there is, based on Darrell Bem's research, reason to take seriously a backwards causation. And I can guarantee you that your opponent and his corner coaches are not discussing retrocausality. And so he did it. He won the fight. And here's just some weird wrinkle. I don't know what to make of this. I mean, he may have won the fight anyway, but he certainly felt very good about it. He looked relaxed together, very in good humor. I mean, he really just went out there a champion. His entry music, usually fighters, I mean, you're a wrestling promoter, fighters very often come out to this ear bleeding, like, techno metal or like, drill rap or something.
How you are dressed.
What's that?
How you are dressed is how they...
Exactly.
What this sounds like.
He came out to the Belinda Carlisle song, Heaven is a Place on Earth. And one of the ringside announcers said, the fact that he's coming out to Belinda Carlisle makes me so happy. And I've never written about Belinda Carlisle. I've never spoken about Belinda Carlisle. I had a crush on Belinda Carlisle in high school. I love the Go-Go's. About a week later, just apropos of nothing and out of nowhere, I get voicemails DM'd to me on Instagram. I still have them on my phone, of Belinda Carlisle saying, I love your stuff, I love your work, I'm really a fan, and blah, blah, blah. So I die, basically, of happiness. I am revived. And the whole thing was just weird and delightful. And I ask people to consider experimenting with this retrocausality. Daryl's experiments were in cognition, but I see no reason why it wouldn't help in athleticism or performing arts or anything that you're doing.
That's fascinating. Yeah, retrocausality in combat sport training is very interesting, and it goes to show that with this amount of research that you presented, that how it can affect everyday people in our lives can be pretty profound. And what I was wondering when I was watching this and I was listening, let's speculate for a second. Let's dreamscape. What do you think our lives would be like if we all were subject to this general belief in culture, mainstream, that ESP is real?
My wish is that it would give the individual a greater sense of possibility in terms of his or her own existence. There are so many people in our culture, especially post-COVID, who are suffering from depression, anxiety. They can't get out of bed. They don't know how to interact with other people. They feel a sense of directionlessness in their lives. And the idea that these categories, these brutally compact categories of past, present, future, might in fact be greatly fluid in ways that we haven't even begun to suspect, could give people such a sense of possibility in their lives. That would be my wish.
Well, that's pretty incredible, and also this general, well, it's not an idea, it's represented within this data. Not on Wikipedia, though, right?
Not on Wikipedia.
Yeah, I don't want to get you started on that. Talk about combat sports. Yeah, exactly. You should have seen him in a subway in New York. He was just yelling at the guy, because remember that Wikipedia thing?
Did I do that?
Yeah, you did. It was another, that's season 2 of this podcast. Yeah, Mitch versus Wikipedia. Getting back to my point, it's demonstrated that each of us potentially do have the capability for this. And I think that leads us to ESP Bingo.
All right.
Because tonight we're going to demonstrate that, I believe. And maybe we will pull up some assistance from...
I think we're going to need help.
Yeah, Jacqueline?
I need help.
Yeah, so I guess firstly, would you introduce the concept of Zener cards once again?
Oh, sure. The point of Zener cards, which you saw in Ghostbusters, and it was accurately depicted, is it's simply 5 images and you attempt a so-called guess hit. That's what the language that J.P. Ryan used. And, if you make your guess hit and you're scoring 20%, that's pretty normal. But if you're scoring higher than 20%, something's going on. And if this occurs over tens of thousands, hundreds, then millions of trials, we have an ESP effect. Now, our research tonight is going to be perhaps a little bit more of a colloquial nature. It'll be fanciful, as we like to say.
Yeah, fanciful.
It's a speculative research.
Hey, let's see how it goes before we put it down. Yeah. All right, let's see how it goes. All right. So what do I got here?
Well, we need a sender, don't we?
What do I have here?
I don't know.
What is this? It's
a cross.
I'm not testing you right now. This is it's 25 cards. It's 5 of each symbols, and this would be very similar to what the traditional decks are
Yes,
that
it
are
is.
used. All right. Okay, so we do require a sender. Is there anyone out there tonight that wants to be a part of this?
I see a hand.
Yeah. What are we?
Towards the
Yeah,
back?
okay, cool.
Yeah. We have our sender.
Oh, what's up? Hey, Brooke.
Oh, yeah, okay.
All right, so
We should identify the symbols one more time.
we should.
Do you want to put the symbols up on the screen, Jacqueline, so everybody can see them? Right, exactly.
So, do you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Brooke.
Excellent. And you're not from here. You traveled a long way to get here just for this.
Just for this, I'm from Toronto.
Oh, thank you. Wow. Thank you for making the effort.
Yeah. Well, what we're going to do and how this works is that I'm going to give this to you. You're going to choose a card from it. You are going to look at the card, but you're not going to show the audience. And then for 30 seconds, you're going to focus on that symbol, and you're going to project it out to these wonderful people. And then what is going to happen is you're trying to imagine what that symbol is of the 5. Then we will reveal what that symbol is, and if you got it, you'll mark it down on your card. This is how this works.
And if I may add, the middle space, that's a freebie, just like regular bingo. So if you get 3 in a row, you can also count the middle space as a freebie.
Okay, I think that's about 30 seconds. Yeah, okay.
So we have the sender, and now what we're gonna do is she's gonna reveal what that was, and if you gotta hit mark it on your bingo card, I'm gonna put it up on the screen, whatever it is, just in case somebody doesn't hear or otherwise understand what the card was. So what was your card for this one? Can you reveal it? Okay, so it's like the squiggly lines. So if you got squiggly lines on your bingo card and you want to mark it off because you got that hit, this is honor policy, of course. You can put that on there. And again, like regular bingo, you guys are going to call out bingo as soon as you get 3 in a row with that free space, okay? So now we're going to go on to the next card that's going to be concentrated and sent out into the audience. So on to card 2.
Okay, and we'll start 30 seconds now. Okay. Reveal.
All right, so we got the plus sign Anyone getting hit so far? Yes? Oh, yes. Yeah, just like I mean, I know these cards have some, repeats, so just you have to also strategize, right? So you might have like a couple stars on your card. You got to pick which one you think is going to be the 3 in the row. That's also maybe part of the ESP. Okay, so on to the third card.
Ready, Brooke? All right, cool. So 30 seconds. Okay. What do we got?
All right, we got the circle.
Circle. Like the rustling around is a sign. Did you psychic bingo?
Yes, yeah. Okay, so on to the next, yeah?
On to the
You
next.
good? Oh,
Bingo?
Wow. Okay, so we have a bingo winner already.
Come on. Yeah.
It's uncanny, isn't it? It's a validated parapsychological device.
Amazing. Are you okay to continue?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great. Well,
Yeah,
we'll
let's do
keep
it.
going because there's
keep
there's
going.
still some more
Yeah,
some more prizes.
yeah.
Yeah, we made this a little simplified. We made it 3x3 instead of 5x5 because we were like concerned that people wouldn't get hits. Oh yeah, it's well.
But shouldn't we, it's like whoever claims it first. I think it Either we'll do another round, but keep trying. You need community approbation.
Okay, so. Oh yes, question.
Oh, it's a good portion of the experiment. Yeah. Ooh. Amazing. Okay, let's try it that way then. 30 seconds. All right. Square.
All right.
Oh, good. Run up. Get your prize.
Another bingo.
Careful
Amazing.
with these. Yeah. Okay. Now that the good prizes are done, you get a signed copy of my book, Modern Occultism.
Woo. We really didn't think this was going to work at all, so this is very nice.
It's very affirming. We should have done the 5x5.
Cheers. We're just going to keep going.
Draw like just a random, maybe just do a random poll. Okay, 30 seconds. Okay, there's 30 seconds. What do we have? Square. We have a square.
Oh, we got it.
Bingo!
All right, Heidi.
Heidi, all right. Heidi, ESP, bingo, winner. Well, pentagram.
Brooke, have you ever done this before? Have you ever practiced with center cards or projecting thoughts out into an audience?
Oh, when you added the to the audience.
Yeah, I know.
Projecting thoughts, yes. These cards, no. My mom and I told you, but my mom and I have great ESP. My mom and I have great ESP.
She's been training. Yeah. Do we want to do one more?
We can do another. Do we have Zener cards to give out as a prize?
We do, yes. Yeah. All right, let's do one more. You guys down? One more? Okay. Okay, 30 seconds. All right. What do we have? Okay, that was the plus sign.
All right, plus sign.
And we have a bingo.
No Zener cards. Oh, you got it.
Nice. All right. Well, success.
Uncanny, wasn't it?
It was uncanny. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, yours. Yeah. Thank you, Brooke.
Do you want to do any Q&A?
Yeah, I suppose we have a little bit of time here, so if anyone has any questions, comments, shit talking about Wikipedia or
Right.
general skeptics, you can get him like really riled up about those things. It's very fun. Please, yeah. Does anybody have any questions?
I was curious what your 30-day protocol for retrocausality is. Do tell.
30-day mental challenge. It's super simple. You can find it on Medium if you just put in 30-day mental challenge. It's free. You write out a vow to focus your thoughts on what is positive, productive, advancing for 30 days. If you fall off it, you don't worry. You don't start over. You just keep going, going, going. Box check. And you watch very carefully for the results in your life, because very often people record remarkable things, including at the very beginning. And I've expanded my point of view on the exercise recently to the retrocausal and believing. I tell you, it's the weirdest thing. I've used this exercise with a lot of people. There was a friend in New York City. We met her recently, who was applying for a job at a religious organization. She really needed the job. She really wanted the job. It didn't work out. She was despondent. And I said, look, just try this thing. And she did. And listen, I know this is testimonial, but all I can tell you is the truth. A week later, the boss called and said, listen, we did have to give this job to somebody else, but another similar job has opened with even more hours. Would you like it? It worked out, So I think that it's an exercise worth trying. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Mitch. Has there been any experiment with the Zener cards with people in emotionally enhanced conditions, like through music or through film, and then have them try the test?
Such a great question. Thank you. J.B. Rhine was so conservative as a scientist that something that I would regard as monumental, he would just relegate to a footnote somewhere. He was perhaps overly conservative about extrapolating from his own data, because his job, as he saw it, was just to provide the stats. But he wrote a monograph in 1934 called Extrasensory Perception. And in an afterward to a British edition of the monograph, he remarked that he recorded time and time again in the lab that ESP results would spike if there was an atmosphere of good spirits, comity, enthusiasm, and that if the subject was bored, fatigued, what have you, and he or she left the lab, had a cup of coffee, had a smoke, came back in, the results would spike again. And he said he actually saw a correlation between caffeine and ESP results. And he felt that a spirit of, I'll say this, these weren't his terms, but hopeful expectancy seemed to be a key factor in spiking the ESP response.
It's fun to watch you run across the auditorium. No, so you brought up Harry Houdini, and the narrative is not just that the afterlife experiments failed, but the narrative is also that Bess says 10 years is long enough to wait for any man, and that's what we hear. Just up the street at the Knickerbocker Hotel. Where did you uncover the reality of that, of the confirmation of the medium and Bess's experiments with Harry from the afterlife?
It is so hard sometimes to sort this stuff out because there are so many competing narratives. And when you begin to research this material, it's unbelievable because people will reference things they'll source reference things to books that turn out to be wrong. You know, I looked through news coverage of the day. I went through both the spiritualist press and the mainstream press. And the reportage that initially came out after the Arthur Ford seances was that Bess Houdini conceded that Ford, using the secret code, which couldn't have been available to anyone, was successful, and Ford, or anybody who cracked the code, was supposed to receive $10,000. And then people began to say, we're not so clear that this is true, and there were these insinuations that she and Ford were having some sort of a tryst and that she was plotting to give him the $10,000 because he was her boyfriend. And then eventually the media coverage starts to change and say, Bess has now said that maybe Ford is a fraud. And so she desisted after 10 years, and the sum of money was never paid out. And it's like this with spiritualism. You know, Margaret Fox, one of the Fox sisters, towards the end of her life, actually one of the things I didn't mention is that when Mary Todd Lincoln visited William Mumler, the spirit photographer, she was in Boston. She also visited Margaret, and she made an inadequate attempt to disguise herself. She called herself Mrs. Linder, and she wore a veil, and people at the seance table knew who she was, and they talked to reporters, and it was very embarrassing for her. And about 3 years later, her one surviving son, Robert, had Mary Todd committed to an asylum, claiming that she was squandering her estate on this spiritualist hoo-ha. And she had to smuggle out legal letters from the asylum demonstrating that she was of sound mind. And she was released after 6 months, and she left on a long European tour and never fully resided in America again. She was very, very resentful. Margaret was experiencing financial troubles, arguments with her family, and she told a reporter who paid her and told an audience at a New York City theater that the spirit rappings heard in Rochester were the cracking of her toe joints. And even David Hume would be like, no, really? And it strains credulity to believe that explanation. But history records that Margaret recanted. Then, about a year later, Margaret rescinded her recantation and said, actually, no, that was bullshit. I was just saying that to get money because I was financially desperate. So, you know, it's one of these constant back and forths that's very hard to get to the bottom of.
Well, it's something you've talked about in other work around the gender dynamics of spiritualism being one of the most prominent female-led religious movements in the United States and across the world, but then also dealing with don't get too far into it, it will have you committed, whereas on maybe the male side of things, it's seen as legitimate research or legitimate scientific undertakings, and not hysteria and mental issues.
So it's just neurasthenia, and go to your fainting couch, you know. One of the things I pointed out in Occult America, which was at the time very controversial and today is less so, is that when the spiritualist movement began in the wake of Kate and Margaret Fox, most spirit mediums were women. And as the movement became popular, which it did very quickly, there were clubs and societies and newsletters and newspapers, and any woman who wanted a role in the civic or religious culture could find it through spiritualism, through this supernatural structure that sprang up in America. And the spiritualist movement and the suffragist movement early on became entwined. Now, twin strands of DNA. The Seneca Falls Conference for Women's Rights was held about 40 miles down the road from where the Fox sisters lived. And this was not happenstance. This was not coincidental. Spiritualism and suffragism were absolutely joined for several generations in the 19th century. And Susan B. Anthony herself, who later in life was an atheist, wrote a letter when she was young to Elizabeth Cady Stanton about how shy she was about speaking from stage. And she wrote to her in totally ingenuous tones, "Oh, how I wish for 2 weeks I could be a spirit medium." Because women who were spirit mediums were look, most people had never seen a woman even speak in public before, much less preside over a meeting or something. So it was extraordinary. And people, even then, 2009, wasn't that long ago, wouldn't accept it. And now that's being more and more taught and understood. Hey, Jen. I think we're gonna have to split the difference.
Thank you. That was awesome, first of all.
See you.
I'm very curious. You talked briefly about Timothy Leary. What are your thoughts on the current research that's being done in the psychedelic field on mapping these territories and exploring these realms? I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Nunautics, how they're doing work with DMT and kind of literally mapping the realm of those slices in time. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
It's so important because when, Leary, and this is subject to debate, but supposedly Richard Nixon called him the most dangerous man in America. And he was arrested and jailed on the most egregiously trumped up charges. It was complete nonsense. And it stymied research into psychedelics, at least above ground research, for more than a generation. And nowadays, these experiments, whether they're microdosing or uses of ketamine to recover from depression, they're taking place with much greater alacrity. And again, it's like a genie that cannot be put back in the bottle. It's such an exciting time because I think we are seeing new research into psychedelics, not only for recovery from emotional trauma and depression, anxiety, but I think we're going to start to see a major resumption of parapsychological experiments into the uses of psychedelics. There's a now dead parapsychologist, Andreas Puharich. There'll be a documentary coming out about him soon. And he discovered what he referred to as a mushroom X found growing in Mexico that heightened parapsychological abilities. And that's why we call one of our episodes Mushroom X. And I think, and in fact, you can find this on YouTube. There was a show that preceded The Twilight Zone called One Step Beyond that was on network television, and they dedicated one episode to, it was their only documentary episode. They dedicated one episode to on-camera testing of this Mushroom X. And all this stuff went underground, after Leary was arrested and jailed. And now it's coming back above ground. So it's just like one more realignment that we're seeing. Should we do one more?
Yeah, we got time for one more. This is what happens when you have one more and then no one.
I was going to tell a parapsychology joke if somebody did.
Please, get the mic, quick.
Now I'm going to tell it. What's Daryl Bem's favorite movie? I know what you undid last summer. Right? Feel free to use that, everyone.
I was just going to ask, are there any exercises you would recommend to increase your ESP or remote viewing?
Well, the exercises that are used in the Gansfeld experiments are comfortable sensory deprivation, and the subject is induced into a state called hypnagogia, which is a state where you're exquisitely relaxed, but you're still conscious. You still have control over your cognition. And actually, we enter that state naturally twice a day, just before falling to sleep at night and just as we're coming to in the morning. And it's a natural state. It's very relaxing. You might experience waking dreams, hallucinations. You might see images like morphing, like bending in a Salvador Dali landscape. You might hear noises, have audible hallucinations, but you have control over your cognition. And through the Gansfeld experiments, that has been identified as prime time for ESP occurrence. I also think it's prime time for self-suggestion, visualization, affirmations, prayers. It's a state of consciousness that is being studied by sleep researchers and neurologists, but it's not well understood because it's a borderline state between ordinary cognition and dream cognition. And it's a very flexible time, and it seems to be a time of peak occurrence for ESP. So it happens twice a day naturally, and I would use that and see what you might be able to derive from it. Like, for example, you and a friend might be going to sleep at relatively the same time. He or she might serve as the receiver, you might be the sender. Maybe you might find an instance of a shared imagery that's quite remarkable.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so very much.
Thanks,
Such a pleasure
everyone.
to be here. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.